And we're now recording. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts with Peter Muise. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for being the primary sponsor. But more importantly, I want to thank all the libraries who are partnering with Tewksbury for tonight's event. And those libraries include Billerica, Boxford, Clinton, Dracut, Lowell, Merrimack, Newbury, Northfield, North Reading, Norwood, Rowley, West Newbury, and Hudson, New Hampshire. So we thank those 12 libraries or so for their promotion and marketing of this event. So tonight we're joined by historian and author Peter Muise for a discussion of his new book, brand new book, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, Legends, Victims, and Sinister Spellcasters. We're going to learn about the earliest Puritan accounts of 17th century witches, urban legends about desolate locations haunted by ghostly witch hunt victims, tales of Cape Cod sailors battling witches, the Dogtown witches, and Half-Hanged Mary, the witch who died twice and inspired the Handmaid's Tale. So Peter, who has appeared on the Travel Channel's Mystery at the Museum, is the author of Legends and Lore of the North Shore. He's a contributor to the Real Witches of New England, and he's a blogger at New England Folklore. So all 100 of us here, so approximately, that are watching live on Zoom, and those that will be watching on Facebook and later on YouTube, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Peter for joining us here tonight. And Peter, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for the great introduction. Robert, if my sound is off or anything, just verbally let me know and I will increase my volume or things like that. So, and just so folks know, I changed my presentation after I sent the description. So I'm going to touch on some of the things Robert said and some additional things. And so it will be a little different, but equally exciting, I think. So again, my name's Peter Muise. I'm going to talk with you about witchcraft in Massachusetts from 1641 to 2021. So we're talking about 380 years of witchcraft, accusations, legends, and even maybe some alleged paranormal encounters. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'm excited to share it with you. So if you want to submit questions via the chat function, I can try to answer them when my presentation ends. So first, a little bit about me. One second, here we go. So first, a little bit about me. I was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and have been interested in folklore, legends, and myths pretty much my entire life. And I've been writing about New England's folklore for quite a few years. I started with a blog, New England Folklore, in 2008. And I still update that blog several times a month. And so this is newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. Or if you just look up New England Folklore blog, it's pretty much the only one that you will find, I think. In 2014, I published Legends and Lore of the North Shore with the History Press. And I've also had pieces published in 13 Most Haunted Crime Scenes Beyond Boston, and also in Magical Folk, British and Irish Fairies, 500 AD to the present. But most relevant to tonight's talk, I'm also the author, as Robert mentioned, of Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, which was just published by Globe Pequot on September 1st of this year. And so the book is a collection of historical witchcraft trial accounts, local legends and folklore, and again, even some contemporary paranormal encounters that people have reported. There are more than 70 different stories in the book from many cities and towns across the Commonwealth, plus several sections just about the Salem witch trials. I've presented for the Tewksbury Library before, but tonight's talk will contain new material I haven't presented for Tewksbury in the past. So I'm going to cover three different historical eras tonight. First, we're going to talk about the Puritan Era. There were 50 years of witchcraft accusations and trials in Massachusetts in the 1600s, ending with the 1692 Salem witch trials. So this is the era when witchcraft was a crime and very serious business. We'll also talk about the 18th and 19th century. And in this time frame, there were no longer any witchcraft trials. And although belief was fading, some people still believed in witches. And you find a lot of really interesting legends and stories from this time period, I think. And finally, we'll talk about the modern era. And there are still legends being told about witches in Massachusetts today, but people often talk about them as paranormal encounters or ghost stories. They're often tied to certain spooky locations that people want to go visit. So what is a witch? There are a lot of different definitions to that word. You'll hear a lot of definitions for the word witch, and people use it in a lot of different ways. For the purpose of tonight's talk, I'm using sort of an older classical definition of a witch is someone who causes harm through magical means. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking about Wiccans or other people who practice magic or witchcraft today. I think a lot of people these days will practice witchcraft or Wicca as a religious tradition or a spiritual path. And that's very different from how people would have thought about witches in New England 300 years ago or even 100 years ago. So I'm going to focus more on this classical definition of witchcraft. And also, I'm not going to talk about magic and witchcraft beliefs of the Native Americans from this area, since that's a much more complicated subject, I think. So let's start off. Massachusetts was colonized by English Puritans in the 1600s. So Plymouth was founded in 1620, Salem in 1626, Boston 1630, Haverhill 1640, et cetera. This was almost 400 years ago, and this is well before the Enlightenment and well before the scientific revolution took place. So to put the Puritans in historical perspective, some of the early colonists could have seen Shakespeare's plays performed live on stage for the very first time. So we're really talking about a very different historical era, very, very long time ago. And this is basically the late Renaissance. And so they had very different beliefs than we have now, particularly about the supernatural. So many of the Puritans came from part of England called East Anglia. Many of the Puritan colonists who came to New England came from East Anglia. And East Anglia was an area where there was a strong belief in witches. The biggest witchcraft hunts in England happened in East Anglia. And so I don't think it's a big surprise that the biggest witch hunts in America happened here, which was settled by people from East Anglia. Basically, the Puritans brought their witchcraft beliefs across the ocean with them from East Anglia to New England. The Massachusetts Puritans took witchcraft very, very seriously. In 1641, they passed a law making witchcraft a crime punishable by death. And here it is, and I will read it to you. If any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. And there are also some citations there that they include in the law from the Bible, just to kind of lend a little extra moral validity to what they were doing here. And as you can see from this law, the word witch was applied to both women and men, but additional terms are also sometimes used for men, like conjurer, wizard, or necromancer. But women usually just were called witch. The law here also references familiar spirits, and it's right there in this law from 1641, familiar spirits. Many of the Puritans believed that witches were served by small demons or imps, and these small demons or imps were called familiar spirits, or sometimes just called familiars. And familiar spirits often appear in the shape of small animals like cats, birds, or toads, but they sometimes were said to appear as small, half-human, half-animal monsters. And it was believed that witches had to feed them with their own blood, and the familiar spirits suckled the witch's blood through what they called witch teats on the witch's body. And you'll see often during a trial, witches were examined to see if they had any unusual protuberances on their bodies. And these were believed to be their witch teats, but let's face it, in reality, they were just things like pimples or moles, but the Puritans thought that these were witch teats. So let's move on. So it was believed that witches were motivated by anger, by greed, and by jealousy, and they used their magical powers to cause suffering for their neighbors. They disrupted households by cursing livestock, hexing butter churns, hexing spinning wheels and looms, things like that, and making food turn rotten. They caused strange phenomena like doors opening on their own. They caused mysterious noises. They made objects fly around a room all by themselves. So basically similar to what modern people might call poltergeists. And lastly, they tormented, killed, and sickened men, women, and children. The Puritan clergy thought witches had these evil powers because they had made a deal with the devil, but the average Puritan didn't necessarily share this perspective. Witches were just part of life to them. They were just a problem that you had to endure or deal with. In 1641, that law was passed. And then in 1644, Governor John Winthrop wrote in his diary about an alleged necromancer who had died in Boston Harbor. And the alleged necromancer had been a crew member on a ship from Virginia, which exploded in Boston Harbor when someone accidentally fired a pistol into its gunpowder supply. So many men died, and all of their bodies were found except for that of this alleged necromancer. On January 18th, a few days after the ship sank, people in Boston reported seeing strange glowing lights floating above the harbor. At times, the lights formed the shape of a man, which roamed above the harbor, and at other times, they just flew around and emitted sparks and flames. John Winthrop also reported the following, and this is a quote from his diary. About the same time, a voice was heard upon the water between Boston and Dorchester, calling out in a most dreadful manner, "Boy, boy, come away, come away," and suddenly shifted from one place to another a great distance, about 20 times. It was heard by diverse godly persons. So basically, people in Boston are seeing these strange lights and hearing this sort of ominous voice over Boston Harbor. And the implication here is that the voice was the devil, and he had come to take away the soul of the dead necromancer. And I bring this up, this case in particular, because it's one of the earliest accounts of a witch in Massachusetts. Now, just to be clear, there were no real witches in New England. The people who were accused of witchcraft were people, usually women, who were eccentric or unpopular with their neighbors for a variety of reasons and wound up being accused of witchcraft. Between 1620 and 1691, there were at least 83 trials for witchcraft in New England, 50 in Massachusetts, and most of the rest were in Connecticut. This is before the Salem Witch Trials even happened in 1692. So these 83 trials do not include the Salem Witch Trials at all. From those 83 trials, 11 people were executed, and 5 of them, all women, lived in Massachusetts. And here are the names of the people who were executed here in Massachusetts. And you'll note they all live very close. They all live very close to Boston. And just one note here, Goody Glover, the last person on this list, Goody is not her first name. Goody is short for good wife, which was a term similar to Mrs. that was used in the 17th century. So there are lots of, you'll see like Goodwife Smith or Goodwife Perkins or Goody Perkins or Goody Smith. Here we see Goody Glover. Goody Glover's first name is not really known, but tradition says it was Mary. I just want to point out that Puritan society places very strict rules for behavior on women, and some of these women who were executed as witches broke those gender rules in one way or another. For example, Anne Hibbins was a very wealthy and privileged woman, but was argumentative and had been excommunicated from the church. Goody Glover was argumentative as well, and she was also Irish Catholic in Boston at the time, which was a very English Puritan city. Alice Lake of Dorchester had sex before marriage, became pregnant, and tried to give herself an abortion. And she failed and married the father of her child, but her past transgressions influenced her neighbor's view of her as a sinful person and a possible witch. And Margaret Jones of Charlestown worked as a healer, and women healers often came into conflict with male physicians, but it's not entirely clear if that's what led to the witchcraft accusations against her. I'll just mention here, Elizabeth Kendall doesn't quite fit the pattern, and documentation is a little sketchy for her trial there. So men as well as women were accused of witchcraft at this time. And we already talked about the alleged necromancer, but men were generally not convicted and executed. For example, in 1652, John Bradstreet of Rowley was brought into court on suspicion of witchcraft. Several neighbors from Rowley and Ipswich testified against him, claiming Bradstreet told them that he had read from a book of magic and achieved strange results. And the court records from the time state the following: "We present John Bradstreet of Rowley for suspicion of having familiarity with the devil. He said he read in a book of magic, and that he heard a voice asking him what work he had for him. He answered, 'Go make a bridge of sand over the sea. Go make a ladder of sand up to heaven and go to God and come down no more.'" So court records from this time are sometimes a little cryptic, but I want to point out that books about topics like astrology and other sort of magical things were quite common in 17th century Massachusetts, even though the Puritan leadership disapproved of them. So from this account, it sounds as if Bradstreet used a book of magic to summon a spirit of some kind, but then he quickly dismissed it, telling the spirit to leave him and go back up to heaven. Now, did this really happen, or was John just kind of boasting about this to some neighbors? The court didn't think it really happened. Rather than convict Bradstreet of witchcraft or familiarity with the devil, the court found him guilty of lying, and he was ordered to pay a fine or be whipped. And I think this might seem like a steep punishment to a modern audience, but it was relatively light punishment for the time, particularly compared to what could have happened if he had been found guilty of witchcraft, which was a crime punishable by death. And I suspect if he had been a woman, he would have been found guilty, but he just got off with the fine for supposedly lying. So clearly the most famous Puritan witch trials were those that happened in Salem in 1692. Over 150 people were accused and 19 people were executed. It was 14 women and 5 men. And one man died while being tortured. He's Giles Cory, who was pressed to death with heavy stones. And then at least 4 people died in jail. And that was 3 women and 1 man. And overall, the Salem witch trials were just a huge, huge tragedy. And there have been many, many books written about the Salem witch trials, mainly because asking the question, like, why were they so much larger than all the other previous witch trials that had happened in Massachusetts? And I think there are a few different reasons. First of all, the Salem witch trials started when 2 young girls claimed they were being magically attacked by witches. And that had happened before in Massachusetts. But these 2 young girls were the daughter and niece of Samuel Parris, who was the minister of Salem Village Church. And people at the time felt this was an attack by Satan himself on the Puritan church, which is really the bedrock of the time of the Massachusetts colony. So therefore, this attack on the minister's family was considered a very serious matter. And also at this time in 1692, the Puritan colonists were under a lot of pressure. The colony had suffered many attacks from Native American tribes, and hundreds of English settlers in Maine had been massacred, villages had been burned, things like this. And so the people in Massachusetts and in Salem were very much aware of these forces kind of coming in to attack the colony. And so people were very anxious and looking for like an outlet for all this anxiety and anger they were feeling. So those are a couple of reasons why the Salem trials were so much bigger. But also, it's important to note that the judges who oversaw the Salem trials made some really bad decisions that allowed these trials to grow to such an enormous size. For example, according to British law, a plaintiff, that is the person making an accusation, normally had to pay a monetary fee when accusing an individual of a capital crime like witchcraft. And this was supposed to prevent frivolous court cases. But the Salem judges waived this requirement, and this allowed anyone with a grudge to accuse multiple people of witchcraft at no cost. So suddenly this is like people had no disincentive to accuse their neighbors of witchcraft. The judges also allowed spectral evidence to be considered during the trials. And the Puritans believed that witches could send their souls or their specters out of their bodies to torment their victims. And only the victims could see these specters, however, which made accounts of spectral evidence really unreliable, accounts of spectral attacks unreliable as evidence. After all, how could a jury determine if an unseen specter was real and not just a dream, or a hallucination, or just an outright lie? But the Salem judges ignored legal precedent and declared that spectral evidence would count as real evidence, even in the absence of any other physical proof of witchcraft. So this effectively meant that an accuser's account of spectral attack, no matter how absurd, had to be considered as evidence sufficient to convict someone. And finally, the judges did not execute anyone who pled guilty. They believed a vast conspiracy of witches was plotting to destroy Massachusetts, and they were determined to find all of the witches. And in order to do this, they needed accused witches to provide the names of their fellow witches to the court. So the judges had this enormous incentive to get people to cooperate. The judges spared the lives of anyone who pled guilty and named other alleged witches. So this had 2 consequences. First, only the people who told the truth, that is, that they were not really witches and they were innocent of witchcraft, only those people were executed. And second, most people arrested as witches knew the judges were sparing anyone who pled guilty and named names. So to save their lives, they would falsely confess they were witches and then name their friends and neighbors as witches as well. And so this led to this ever-growing number of alleged witches that filled the jails. This more than 150 people who were accused. So Most historians think the Salem witch hunt was caused by social and psychological factors, like I just talked about. But what if there was a simple biological cause? Wouldn't that be great? And this was the thesis proposed in 1976 by Linda Carporial, who was a biology grad student at UC Santa Barbara. And Carporial suggested that ergot, which is a fungus found on grain, might be responsible for the witch trials. So just to explain this a little bit, the English colonists in Massachusetts grew large amounts of rye, which is a grain similar to wheat, but grows well in New England. And during warm, wet weather, ergot grows on rye. And ergot contains a compound similar to the hallucinogen LSD. People who consume rye infected with ergot can suffer from hallucinations, auditory disturbances, convulsions, strange skin sensations, vomiting, even psychosis. So these symptoms sound like the symptoms suffered by some of the afflicted girls in Salem. And Carporial argues that a wet spring and summer in 1691 could have infected the grain in Salem with ergot. And so she suggests the spectral visions and strange fits the afflicted girls experienced were caused by the fungus. And when I say afflicted girls, it was more than just those two young girls. It was a crowd of like 60 or 70 people who claimed they were afflicted by witchcraft. And the majority of them were sort of teenaged girls or women, but they're also older women. There were men. I think the oldest was like an 80-year-old grandfather who claimed he was afflicted by witches. So Carporial's theory received a lot of publicity when it was published. It was even on the front page of the New York Times. But a critique was published a couple of years later by Nicholas Spanos and Jack Gottlieb, who were two psychologists from Carleton University. And they argued there really wasn't that much strong evidence connecting ergotism with some witchcrafts. There's some biological reasons they cited. For example, ergotism is only found, convulsive ergotism rather, is only found in people with a vitamin A deficiency. But the farmers in Salem Village consumed lots of dairy products, and the people in Salem Town ate plenty of fish, both foods rich in vitamin A. So they probably would not have had this convulsive ergotism. They would have had a different type of ergotism, which causes your flesh to rot and fall off your body, like gangrenous ergotism, which no one reported. So it seems like there probably wasn't that much ergot actually happening in Salem at the time. And they also point out that some of the symptoms of convulsive ergotism, like vomiting and diarrhea, those were not present in Salem. Permanent dementia and even death can also occur, and neither of those happen either here. I would also think the most compelling evidence that it was not ergotism is that the afflicted girls experienced their torments only at specific times, usually when they were in the courtroom, when the accused witches were brought in. And outside of the courtroom, they were usually symptom-free. So I think this strongly suggests that their symptoms were not caused by ergotism. And after the trials, many people who testified said they did so only because they feared imprisonment or execution. So I think it would be nice if the witch trials had been caused by something as simple as a fungus, but I think regrettably, it seems more likely that it was human ignorance and malevolence that were more likely to blame here. The Salem Trials were the last witch trials held in Massachusetts. When they ended, people generally agreed they were a political, social, and just religious disaster. But despite this, many people did not stop believing in witches. They still believed in witches. They just decided it was impossible to prove they existed in court. So in the 1700s and 1800s, you still find lots of stories about witches in Massachusetts, but most of these stories are legends. They're not court trials, but these legends are often about people who really lived. I'm going to share now a few legends from the 1700s. These are not as well known as the Salem Trials at all, but I think they're interesting stories. So let's start with Sylvanas Rich. He was a sea captain from Truro, Massachusetts. And according to a legend, one day while sailing north along Truro's Atlantic coast with a shipment of grain bound for Boston, he spies this hut nestled in the Truro dunes. If you've ever been to Truro, it has these really massive sand dunes on the Atlantic coast. So Sylvanas Rich tells his crew to drop anchor because he wants to see if he can get some milk. He's tired of just drinking brackish water and beer. So he rows to shore, and when he rows back to the ship, he has a bucket of milk with him. He says to his crew, "The hag in that hut was the ugliest woman I have ever seen. But this milk is the sweetest milk I've ever had. Raise anchor. I'm going to my cabin to drink this milk." As soon as he goes below decks into his cabin, though, this freak storm comes up and shreds the ship's sails. And the ship is cast adrift off into the Atlantic. And the crew pounds on Captain Rich's door, but he does not come out until the morning. And when he comes out, he says, "The hag came to me yesterday. She came to me last night after I drank her milk. She threw a horse's bridle over my head and rode me up and down the Cape like a stallion. Whenever I slowed down, she dug her heels into my sides. See?" And he lifts up his shirt, and the crew can see his body is covered with bruises shaped like a woman's shoe. And then Captain Rich lowered his shirt and said, "And now I must return to my cabin. She'll come for me again tonight, and I have to be prepared for her." And then he goes back into his cabin and locks the door. And the crew at this point isn't sure if he's grimacing or smiling as he goes back into his cabin. So this goes on for days. The ship is adrift in the open seas because the sails have been destroyed, and each night the witch comes and rides the captain, and maybe Captain Rich likes it. Until finally another ship comes by, and by a great coincidence, it is Captain Rich's son in command of this other ship. So Captain Rich's son somehow snaps his father out of the witch's spell, and unfortunately the legend doesn't say how he does it, because it happens behind the captain's closed cabin door. But somehow Captain Rich's son slaps it out of him or whatever. And so Captain Rich comes back on deck and they repair the sails and they sail the ship to Boston. And when Sylvanas Rich finally arrives in Boston with his cargo of grain, the merchant waiting for it asks him, "Why is it so late? Captain Sylvanas Rich, why is this grain so late?" And Sylvanas Rich answers, "Blame it on the sweet milk of Satan," is what he says. So that's a good legend. And interestingly, there is a grave in Truro Old North Cemetery for a man named Sylvanas Rich. That's a photo of his grave right there. I took it this summer. And he died on July 3rd, 1755 at the age of 35. And historic records show that Sylvanas Rich had a son named Isaiah, but he would have only been 11 when his father passed away, and therefore was too young to be the captain of a ship. So still, the fact that there was a man named Sylvanas Rich on Cape Cod, I think, suggests this legend was based on some sort of faintly remembered incident. So that's the story of Captain Rich there. So let's move on to another Cape Cod story. So the magic witch bridle that was used to ride men like horses, this is a frequent theme in witchcraft legends from the 1700s and the 1800s. So here's a similar story also from Cape Cod. A woman from Barnstable named Liza Tower Hill was suspected of being a witch, and she supposedly rode a man named Benjamin Goodspeed every night while he slept. And so Benjamin Goodspeed tried to escape by boarding a ship and sailing out into the ocean. But even out at sea, she found him and rode him every night. Until finally, one evening at sunset, he's standing on the deck, just exhausted, because he can't get a good night's sleep. And he sees this black cat swimming across the water towards the ship. And he realizes that this cat is Liza Tower Hill, and she's coming to ride him again. So he loads some pages from the Bible into his rifle and shoots the cat with these pages from the Bible. And the cat sinks below the waves with this horrible howl. It's like, "Rah!" Goes under the waves. And then in her cabin, log cabin in Barnstable, Liza Tower Hill dies hundreds of miles away. Right? She's in Barnstable, but she still dies hundreds of miles away. And it's interesting here that Liza Tower Hill was a real person. She died in 1790, presumably just from natural causes, not from being shot with Bible pages. She was never put on trial for witchcraft, but there were many, many legends about her being a witch, a lot of legends about Liza Tower Hill being a witch. And even after her death, people in Barnstable said that her ghost lurked in the woods near her ruined cabin, luring men to the devil with her seductive beauty. And she would try to get men to dance with her and sign their name in the devil's book and things like this. So that's Liza Tower Hill from Barnstable. Let's talk now about the Norton witches. In the 1700s, several women in the town of Norton were suspected of being witches. The most famous of these was a woman named Anne Cobb, who was suspected of being a witch by her neighbors. And the reasons for this suspicion are mostly forgotten, except for the following. One day, Anne went into town to purchase some items, and she lived about 2 miles from the town center, but arrived in town center only minutes after leaving her house. And people suspected she had used supernatural means to travel those 2 miles so quickly. They were thinking maybe she flew or was transported there by some sort of evil spirit. And so the historical sources don't really specify exactly what people thought, but the event was so memorable that the town named a bridge after her. And the bridge still exists today, and it's known as Anne Cobb Bridge or Witch Bridge. It's interesting to note here that Anne Cobb was quite poor. She lived in poverty and was supported financially by the town in her old age. And so she died in 1798. Dora Lennon was another woman suspected of witchcraft. And Dora supposedly caused various forms of mischief around town, like magically setting farm animals loose so they could wander free. And 2 boys also said she once caused them to miss a squirrel they were shooting at. And despite having a shot at this large squirrel, the boys missed it repeatedly with their rifle. And then as they walked home frustrated, they noticed a large cat watching them pass by. And they believed the cat was really Dora, and that she had used witchcraft to make them miss the squirrel. And much like Anne Cobb, Dora Lennon was poor and had to be supported by the town in her old age. And as she lay dying in 1786, her house was supposedly filled with strange and terrible noises that frightened people away who were trying to attend to her death. That's sort of traditional witchcraft legend stuff, those strange noises attending a witch's death. And finally, the third alleged witch in this town was Naomi Burke, and wagons would lose their wheels when they passed by her house, and oxen would escape their yokes. And children supposedly held their breath in fear as they ran past her home, lest she would bewitch them, right? They were super afraid of Naomi Burke. And sadly, though, Naomi Burke committed suicide on July 4th, 1808, which I think is sort of a harsh reminder that these old stories about witchcraft are very entertaining, I think, and they're a little spooky, but I think it was really hard to be the person they were about, right? If you were the suspected witch in town, the alleged witch in town, your life was not a good life. And I think you can also see a pattern here of older, marginalized women being suspected of witchcraft, even in an era when there were no witch trials. So surprisingly, there was almost another witch craze in Salem more than 100 years after the 1692 witch hunt. In 1811, a young woman moved from the Boston slums to Northeast Street in Salem, and this is near Windmill Point in Salem. And the records only give her last name, which was Bancroft, so I'm calling her Miss Bancroft here. So after she moved to Salem, Miss Bancroft began to suffer nightly convulsions similar to those suffered by the afflicted girls in the 1690s. And they were caused, she said, by an old woman who lived in Boston. And clearly, she said, the old woman was a witch. And Miss Bancroft would fall into a trance-like state during which she delivered prophecies as well. And some people in Salem began to think that Miss Bancroft might be a witch herself. Now, during her fits, her afflictions, Miss Bancroft was attended by a small group of people, including 2 ministers. And one of the ministers said he could see the spirit of the Boston witch hovering around Miss Bancroft's bed to torment her. And word about Miss Bancroft's affliction began to spread, and soon crowds were gathering in the street outside her house every night, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. She was a celebrity in town. And the crowds grew larger and more raucous. And on March 3rd, more than 1,000 people filled Northeast Street outside her house, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. The Salem authorities, the city council, whoever was in charge at the time, became alarmed by these increasingly rowdy mob and by the possibility of having another witch hunt in their city, right? They didn't want to tarnish Salem's reputation any further. So a delegation confronted Miss Bancroft and presented her with 2 harsh choices. First, she could remain in Salem, but would be sent to the town workhouse, which was not a great thing. Second choice was she could just leave Salem and never, ever come back. And Miss Bancroft chose option 2. She left Salem and headed north to Maine, and she was not heard from ever again. So that's sort of the end of what we know about Miss Bancroft. Now, in the 1800s, Massachusetts became industrialized, and it was the literary and educational hub of the United States. But still, legends about witches were being told. Fewer people took them literally, but some people still did. In the 19th century, a forested area in Beverly was known as Witches' Woods. And according to local tradition, it got that name when a man named Giles Cory hid there from constables before he was arrested during the Salem Witch Trials. And I mentioned a man who was crushed to death with stones during the Salem Trials. That was Giles Cory. There's no proof he hid in Beverly at all. There's no proof of that. But people in Beverly said Witches Woods was the site of several unusual phenomena. For example, the woods were supposedly haunted by a headless ghost who wandered through the trees carrying his head under his arm. And although this ghost was a source of fear, he was given a humorous nickname. He was called Hetty, right? Hetty, this headless ghost, lurked in the woods. Now, a young woman from a wealthy Salem family named Carolyn King Howard vacationed with her parents in Beverly in the 1840s. This isn't actually a photo of her vacation house. Her family's summer house is called Thistlewood. And Carolyn King Howard never saw Hetty, but she did encounter something even stranger in Witches Woods when she was 19 years old. She found the homestead, which was a haunted farmhouse the locals said appeared and disappeared mysteriously throughout the years. And so it happened like this. One warm day in 1841, Carolyn King Howard, her 9-year-old cousin, and their maid, Lucy Ann, went for a walk in the forest. And after walking for a short while and pausing for a snack, they realized they were lost. And this was puzzling to them since they hadn't walked very far. They should have been able to find their way back to the summer house, but they couldn't. It seemed as if the path they had followed into the woods had just completely vanished. So after walking around in circles for what seemed like hours and hours, they finally came upon the ruins of an old farmhouse. And Carolyn King Howard knew this was what the local people called the homestead, and that it was said to be haunted. And very little remained of the farmhouse. It was just a foundation, a chimney, and a big stone stoop. And there was a huge lilac tree growing next to it. So the three women explored the homestead for a while, but there wasn't very much to see there. And so they soon located a path. They found a path that climbed up this nearby hill. And when Carolyn King Howard and her companions reached the top of the hill, they could see a farmhouse down below them where the ruined homestead should be. But what the farmhouse they saw was not in ruins. It was well kept, and smoke rose from its chimney. There was a very small lilac shrub growing next to it, just a little tiny lilac shrub. And as they watched, a woman emerge and fled a flock of chickens in the front yard, and she was standing on a stone stoop. So Lucy Ann, the maid, ran down the hill to ask the farm wife for directions, and Carolyn King Howard and her cousin stayed up at the top of the hill. So Lucy Ann, the maid, was dejected and confused when she returned up to the top of the hill to see Carolyn King Howard and the cousin. She said she couldn't find the cozy little farmhouse anywhere, just the ruined homestead. But now that she was back on the top of the hill again, she could see the well-kept farmhouse. And it was as if Howard, Lucy Ann, and the young cousin were looking backwards in time almost to a moment in history before the homestead became a ruin. And as they had this realization, it really frightened them because they felt like something was majorly wrong here. And they really became even more eager to find their way out of Witches Woods. And soon they located a dry stream bed, luckily. And after following it towards the ocean, they emerged from the forest right near their summer house. Now, according to Carolyn King Howard, there was also at least one witch living in Beverly at the time. So this is 1841, or at least someone who was suspected of being a witch. And Carolyn King Howard encountered her while visiting a local farm. As she was at the farm, an elderly Black woman came walking down the road, and Carolyn King Howard asked the farmer's wife who she was. And the farmer's wife replied, "Oh, she's a witch. She lives all alone by herself, and the neighbors say she has something called the evil eye. And we are all afraid of her. Although she never did us any harm, but I'm always glad when she comes here to fill her basket with fresh eggs and other good things just to get rid of her." And Carolyn King Howard also noted that many houses in Beverly's had horseshoes nailed on the outside of them to keep witches away. So it seems like the old witchcraft beliefs lingered on in Beverly well into the 19th century. So I want to mention now also this haunted church in Cambridgeport, Massachusetts. Witchcraft stories weren't confined to small towns in the 19th century. For example, in 1881, a reporter from the Boston Globe was sent to investigate rumors that the Cambridgeport Baptist Church was haunted. The church building had recently burned down in a fire, and workers rebuilding the church were encountering unusual phenomena. So here's a quote from the Globe. "Strange sounds are heard at night by persons who pass the ruined building, low moans and cries of intense agony that rise to weird shrieks and die away in long drawn sighs. These unearthly sounds increase in frequency as the work of clearing away the ruin progresses. The reporter from the Boston Globe learned that this was the second time the church had burned down, and that people in the neighborhood believed it was haunted by the ghost of a witch who had been executed in the 1600s. And one older man in Cambridgeport tells the reporter that many years ago, a woman named Anne Hopkins lived in the area. She fell in love with a handsome young soldier, but was driven mad when he was killed by another soldier who wanted Anne for himself. And after that, she lived on the fringes of Cambridgeport and was suspected of being a witch by her neighbors. The people in Cambridgeport blamed her when a smallpox outbreak happened, and they burned her at the stake. And as the flames rose around her, she saw the man who had murdered the young soldier watching from the crowd. So she saw the man who had murdered her lover. And so she shrieks out, "The curse of fire shall be upon this spot forever." Well, at least that's what the old man told the reporter, who was a little skeptical about this. The reporter thought the strange noises were probably caused by telegraph lines. And it's important to note that there is no record of an Anne Hopkins being executed for witchcraft. Plus, it's important to note that the Puritans never burned witches. They always hanged them. The story is probably not true. The Cambridgeport Baptist Church is still standing today, and as far as I know, it's no longer haunted. So let's keep moving on. Moving to the 20th century now. By the 20th century, belief in witches was really starting to fade away. But even still, in 1923, hundreds of people gathered outside a house in Chelsea, Massachusetts, hoping to catch a glimpse of a bewitched man who lived inside. And his torments were so severe that he had to be tied to his bed so he wouldn't hurt himself. This is a classic witchcraft affliction here. And the author Theda Kenyon included an account of this bewitched man in a 1929 article for the North American Review. And according to Theda Kenyon, the man's family at first called a physician to diagnose his ailments. And the physician believed the illness had natural causes, but the patient and his family were skeptical of this diagnosis. They wanted a second opinion, and they brought in a witch doctor from Boston. And I think the term witch doctor needs some clarification, since it's often used as a derogatory term for someone from a non-Western culture who practices a tribal or indigenous religion. And, old Hollywood movies erroneously portray witch doctors as these sinister figures who have like a lot of shrunken human heads and like a giant bubbling cauldron. They're going to throw you in the cauldron. That is not how the term is being used here in 1923. Instead, it simply refers to a doctor who cures witchcraft. If you have problems with your eyes, you go to the eye doctor. If you have a problem with your ears, you go to the ear doctor. If you have a problem with witches, you go to the witch doctor, right? It was a doctor who treated witches. So anyway, the witch doctor comes to Chelsea and he confirms the family's suspicions that their relative was suffering from a magical attack. But the witch doctor also said he could cure the man with a potion composed of 9 special ingredients, one of which was grass from a graveyard. And unfortunately, the article doesn't list the other 8 ingredients, just this one ingredient, which is graveyard grass. And on the day the witch doctor arrived with his potion, a crowd gathered outside the house to see if the potion would work. So at his family's urging, the bewitched man drank this strange brew that the doctor had brought, and slowly his symptoms disappeared. And he was no longer tormented, much to his family's delight. So this graveyard grass potion had worked. So it's hard to determine if the man was really cured by the witch doctor's potion, and skeptics would probably say his symptoms were really just psychosomatic, and the witch doctor removed them just using the power of suggestion. But maybe that's just a form of magic under another name entirely, I think. So legends about witches in Massachusetts are still being told even today, but they are often about certain spooky locations that people visit, hoping or fearing some kind of paranormal experience, right? You go to like a haunted graveyard, you want to see the ghost, you spend the night in a haunted hotel or something like that. So it's the legends of that kind. So here I'm going to talk about a few locations that have spooky legends attached to them about witches or witches' ghosts. Let's start off here. We've got Dudley Road. And this road in Billerica is supposedly haunted by the ghosts of some devil-worshipping nuns who were hanged in the 19th century. And so there's no evidence that this story is true. Like, I don't believe any nuns were hanged for devil worshipping in the 19th century. But Dudley Road consistently appears on the list of the most haunted places in the state of Massachusetts. And the people who live there, I don't think appreciate that notoriety. And I don't think they appreciate the cars full of sightseers who come hoping to catch a glimpse of these undead nuns, these ghostly Satan worshiping nuns late at night. But again, that is the legend attached to this road. And here we got the Witch House in Salem. This house was owned by Jonathan Corwin, who was one of the judges during the Salem Witch Trials. It was probably built around 1630 or 1640, and may have once even been owned by Roger Williams, who was the founder of Rhode Island. So this house is old, and it's open as a museum. I've been to the museum. It's a great place to visit. So if you're in Salem and get a chance, I would definitely go visit the Witch House. People have said for many years that it is haunted. I mean, it's an old house, so I can see why it would get that legend. And in 2011, the Travel Channel show Ghost Adventures filmed an investigation there. And they said they picked up the voice of witch trial victim Bridget Bishop on their electronic equipment. But I can't verify the truth of that, but that's what they said happened there. So that's the Witch House in Salem. We're coming close to the end here, but I do want to talk about another haunted road. This is Albino Road in North Andover. And this is just a dirt road. That's a photo of it I took when I went to visit. And according to a local legend, the road is haunted by the ghosts of twin albino teenage boys who were killed in 1692 by their neighbors who thought they were either witches or demons. Again, there's no evidence that this story is true, but people will still visit this road hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghosts, who, by the way, are angry ghosts and do not like visitors to come to this road. And I actually did not go down this road because I was just afraid of getting deer ticks on me. So deer ticks or ghosts, either way, the road is probably a little spooky, I think. I want to talk also about, this is my last spooky location, although there are definitely others, North Pepperell in Pepperell, Massachusetts. And North Pepperell was a thriving industrial village during the colonial era, but it was supposedly cursed by a witch after she was violently attacked by her neighbors there. And this was like late 1700s, early 1800s. A woman named Mrs. Lovejoy was living in North Pepperell. People in the town suspected she was a witch, and they actually supposedly branded her on the forehead. And she was not happy about this and cursed the town. So there's a series of mysterious deaths in the town, a series of mysterious disappearances, people there, a series of mysterious fires. So buildings were burning, businesses were burning, there were unsolved murders. And slowly over time, the village was abandoned. People just gave up living there. And there was also a river that powered the mills in that town. It was a little industrial village. The river dried up as well. So people often say that this is the result of the curse of the witch, Mrs. Lovejoy. And interestingly, the last person supposedly who suffered from this curse was a town historian, North Pepperell, who gathered all the legends that she could find about Mrs. Lovejoy and the cursed village. And then the town historian was found dead in her own home and apparently had starved to death for no apparent reason. So it's kind of a creepy legend. But nothing apparently remains today of North Pepperell except a few stone walls and just this legend of the vengeful witch, Mrs. Lovejoy. And so that wraps up my presentation for tonight. I know it was a lot of legends packed into a short time, but I wanted to sort of give folks an overview of like Puritan era, witch trial accusations, and then 1700 and 1800s, sort of those legends from that time, and then end with sort of the more modern legends, these sort of paranormal stories about places haunted by witches or ghosts or things like that. So in closing, I'll just say that legends and stories like these, I think they're helpful reminders. They help us remember historic events, and they help us remember the people who lived in this state before us. They also help us remember all the things that make Massachusetts unique and special, I think. And if you do want to read more about witchcraft in Massachusetts, please check out my book, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, which is available online everywhere you would normally buy books, and hopefully at your local library as well. And I just want to thank again the Tewksbury Public Library again for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak here. I think it's a nice audience here at Tewksbury. So that is the end of my presentation. So I think we have time for a few questions. I'm going to stop to share my screen.
Peter, would you like me to read the questions to you?
Sure, that would be helpful.
All right, starting off with a very specific question. Ancestry records for one of my ancestors claims he was tried as a witch. How can I prove or disprove that he was? His name was John Howard from West Bridgewater, Massachusetts. Any suggestions?
That's a good question. There are some books that list all the known witch trials in Massachusetts. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of the names of them because I have them on my bookshelf in the other room. It's easier with the Salem Trials because there's an extensive list there. But there are some books out there. And if you email Robert and he sends me your email, I can at least send you a couple suggestions of books where you can start looking. Can you do that, Robert? Is that allowed?
Yeah, absolutely. I just put my email address in the chat. Christine asks, which Salem was Miss Bancroft from? Was she from Salem Village, aka Danvers, or was she from New Salem?
She was so just to clarify, in the 1600s, when the Salem witch trials happened, Salem was much larger than it is today. And it had lots of different neighborhoods and different areas in it. And so the girls who were afflicted by witchcraft lived in what is called Salem Village, which is a small farming neighborhood within Salem of about 90 households. Salem Village is now Danvers. Some of the people who were accused of witchcraft, though, also lived in Salem Town, which was the part of Salem by the coast, by the harbor. And that is what is now considered Salem today, is that sort of Salem Town. And so, people were imprisoned in Salem, people were executed in Salem. So really the Salem trials happened in Salem Village and Salem Town and other places as well. So all across the board. I think, but Miss Bancroft lived in Salem proper, in Salem Town. So in what is now modern Salem by the coast, that's where she lived.
Jane asks, what made the witchcraft accusations and trials finally end?
That's a good question. I think there was a lot of, as people saw that the number of accusations kept growing, people became more and more concerned about it. And although some people were certainly afraid to speak up, certain ministers, for example, were protesting against it. They were saying this is not correct. There can't be this many witches in Massachusetts. So there was this growing awareness that this was not a good situation. And a lot of people, even at the time, said these afflicted girls are faking it and things like that. And one factor that perhaps contributed was that finally what we call the afflicted girls in Salem accused the governor's wife of being a witch. So they accused Governor Phipps's wife of being a witch. And I think that was probably overreach of their power. And Governor Phipps actually shut the whole thing down. He just like, no, sorry, witch trials are over. That's the end.
Isn't it interesting that once the governor's wife was accused of witchcraft, that's when they decided to stop the whole thing, right?
That was the last straw for people, yeah.
Interesting. David from Seattle asks, is there a particular story you find personally to be the most upsetting?
That's a good question, because they're all, I think all of the 17th century stories are upsetting. So I can't really choose a particular one. I guess, the story about Giles Cory is a grim one, which I think some people know it, but he was a elderly farmer in Salem, and he was not I mean, I'll just say he was not a good person. Like, he had beaten one of his servants to death a few years before the Salem Witch Trials, but had not been convicted of that murder. He got off with just paying a fine. So that was probably one of the reasons he was accused of being a witch. But before Giles Cory was accused of being a witch, his wife, Martha Cory, was accused of being a witch. And Giles Cory actually said, oh yeah, my wife, she really is a witch. I agree, she is a witch. I feel strange when she's around. I see her praying at midnight by the fireplace. I think my wife is a witch. But then, of course, things change. And then he was accused of being a witch as well. And I think he realized his error. When he was put on the stand to testify, he refused to speak. He didn't say a word at all. He didn't say anything. And so that was his legal strategy. He was not going to speak at all and try to avoid being found guilty of witchcraft. Massachusetts law at that time specified that if someone refused to speak in a courtroom, they could be pressed with heavy stones. And he was taken from the courtroom when he refused to speak, and he was tied to the ground in a field nearby. And that field is now the Howard Street Cemetery in Salem. He was tied to the ground. Wooden boards were placed on his body, and the sheriff piled heavy stones onto Giles Cory, who's, again, 81 years old, I think, and keeps saying, oh, Giles Cory, do you have anything to say? And Giles Cory doesn't say anything. So they keep piling more and more stones onto his body. And again, the sheriff says, Giles Cory, do you have anything to say? And Giles Cory's only words are, more weight. And so the sheriffs and his men pile more stones on top of Giles Cory, and he's crushed to death by these heavy stones. And a particularly gruesome detail is that as he dies, Giles Cory's tongue just erupts from his mouth from the sheer pressure of all these stones pressing into his torso. His tongue pops out. And witnesses said that the sheriff used his walking stick to sort of disdainfully poke the tongue back into Giles Cory's mouth. So that was pretty upsetting. Just the fact that he accused his own wife of being a witch, and then the tables are turned on him, and he probably realized what a horrible mistake he had made, and he's pressed to death in such a horrible way. So that's a really gruesome one, I think, from that time. But all the witch stories are really, from that era, are kind of gruesome, I think.
Let's see. Vicky says, thank you so much, Peter. A wonderful presentation. Kathy says, thank you. This has been fascinating. Lori says, thanks, Peter. This was a fantastic presentation with really interesting tales. Let's see.
You're welcome, everybody.
Yeah, Sarah says, I live right off of Dudley Road in Billerica.
Oh.
This was a great presentation. Thank you. Cheryl says this was a great talk. Thank you. So I'm building up your ego here, Peter.
Okay.
We'll take a few more questions. Jennifer asks, do you have a favorite story that did not make it into your book?
Oh, there's something I learned late, and I'm going to get the name wrong, so don't quote me on the name because I did not put it in the book, so it's not sticking in my head well. But there was a woman in Boston in the late 1700s, early 1800s. She was a Black woman who ran a boarding house, and she also, I think, was a caterer. And she was also a fortune teller. And I want to say her name is Chloe Peterson. I could have the name wrong. But she or a publisher in Boston put out a book under her name called the Dream Book, the fortune telling book of Chloe Peterson. And it has various dream interpretations, spells you can use to get a man or a woman to fall in love with you, and things like this. And on the front page of the book, they call her the Old Witch of Boston, or the Black Seer. Seer meaning someone who has, psychic vision. And also in that book that was published in this late 1700s, early to 1800s, there is her biography where she tells how she was captured by slavers in Africa and taken to Virginia and enslaved in Virginia. And she supposedly earned her freedom using her fortune-telling abilities. And she found a buried treasure for somebody that was hidden inside the wall of a plantation house, and so earned her freedom that way and made her way north. So it's a really interesting story. But unfortunately, I didn't learn about it until after I had written the book. So if I ever do a revision, I'm including that one because it's a really interesting story there. So, but it's interesting also that she was publicly being called a witch, and it was a good thing and a way for her to do business basically as a fortune teller.
Stan says, thank you. Judith says, thank you. Well done. Lots of info. Erica says, thank you. I just bought your book today.
Great.
Loved having your presentation alongside it. Dorit says, thank you, Peter, for a great presentation. Rachel says, thank you for the discussion. It was wonderful. Heidi says, thank you. I agree. This was very interesting. And Heidi notes that she's a descendant of Sarah Averill Wilde.
Great.
Let's see here. Dan says, reading your new book now, so perfect timing for this presentation. Thank you. Let's get back to a couple more questions before we wrap up. Let's see. Linda wants to know, where do you go in Salem to get information about the trials?
Oh, there are so many books. There are so many books about the Salem witch trials. And that's the challenge, right? Because there are so many of them. My favorite one is by a woman named Marilyn Roach. It's called like Salem Witch Trials, a Community Under Siege, a day-by-day record or something. And it's like 800 pages long. And it literally is a day-by-day record of the Salem trials. And you like, she goes into detail, like what did this reverend eat on like April 13th, 1691, things like that. So that's like one of my favorites. It has a great index. You can search and find names and see like, oh, where was this person arrested? What did they say when they were on trial? Things like that. So you look up Marilyn Roach if you really want a super, super detailed version. But there are just lots of good books about the Salem trials out there. And I would just poke around. Again, you can ask your librarian. You can probably find some good ones there. And in Salem itself, I feel like I go there more for fun, I think, right? And like I'll go to the Witch House, which is one of the few buildings still standing that has a direct connection to it. You can also go to Proctor's Ledge, which was where they were actually executed. Only recently have historians figured out that that was the exact site. Like people knew roughly where it was, where people were executed, but only recently have they decided it was a place called Proctor's Ledge. And it's really just like a stony outcropping behind, I think, a Walgreens. But they've made that into a memorial. And they figured that out from reading people's diaries of the time. Now, somebody said, oh, I saw the cart go by my house carrying the people to be executed at this place. And they figured out where the house was with the person who wrote the diary. And from there, they could say, oh, it was this stony outcropping. So it's kind of amazing that you can go visit that.
Alex says there's a really cool museum dedicated to the witch trials up in Salem.
That's true. The Salem Witch Museum is fun. That's a good one.
I'm going to condense this question, but essentially Rachel wants to know if there's any laws currently on the book against witchcraft in Massachusetts.
No, all those laws were waived. Those laws were removed. There may be some laws against. Often there are laws against fraudulent fortune telling. So I don't know if there are laws against fraudulent fortune telling in Massachusetts, but some states do have those laws just to prevent people from being taken advantage of, I think, by fraudulent fortune tellers. But if you go to Salem, there are plenty of legitimate fortune tellers there, you know.
Quick answer. Donna says she grew up in Beverly. Where was the summer house located, or what would be its current location?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it was right on the water somewhere, which is why they went up there. And Witch's Woods is now there's just a little swath of conservation land. That's all that's left of it. I think it's all been carved up into houses and things like that. So there is a tiny piece of conservation land. If you look up Witch's Woods, Beverly online, you may be able to find the reference to where the remaining parts of it, but most of it's been carved up now. So I don't know what happened to the homestead. Did it just travel off into time, maybe, or something like that?
All right, we're wrapping up here. Julia says thank you. Marie says thank you. Laura asks, does Peter know of a story about a woman accused of witchcraft who escaped? Who was she? Where did she hide? And by any chance, was Gallows Hill referenced in that story?
That's a good one. I know there's a lot of legends about people who were accused and hid, but are then found and arrested. Like there's a place in Nahant called the Witch House, which is sort of a gazebo, and it's built above a cave by the coast. And a woman hid there, but she was arrested and then brought to Salem. And there's a witch house also in Rockport in Pigeon Cove, which has a very similar story, which John Putnam's wife supposedly hid in this house in Rockport, which I don't think is true. But again, like she hid and then was found. So I'm not sure of this particular one, though, about that involves Gallows Hill. But there are lots of stories about witches hiding and people escaping, and like Philip English, who was a merchant in Salem. I think he and his wife like hid in barrels or something like that and were smuggled out of Salem to escape being accused. And, you know, when they returned after the trials were over, like all their property had been stolen, their house had been ransacked, things like that. So I'm sorry, I don't know the exact story you're referencing, though.
That's okay. David says, thank you so much. This was great. An anonymous attendee asked about the recording. So it will be available on the Town of Tewksbury's YouTube page starting tomorrow. And also I will include the link in the email that I send all the registrants tomorrow morning. Let's end with a question that I attempted to answer for you, but may have gotten wrong. Sandy asked, what's a necromancer? I think you mentioned it at the very beginning of your presentation. I always thought that that was a wizard or a magician or something, but Vicky says that it's specifically someone who conjures and communicates with the dead. What is your definition of a necromancer, Peter?
The way that necromancer was used here means basically evil magician. So I think people use necromancer now as seeing necro as meaning the dead, right? So a necromancer is someone who works with dead spirits or raises the dead. I don't know if that's the exact way it was used here, but necro may have also been derived from Latin terms meaning dark or blackness. And so they're talking about sort of a dark magician or an evil magician, right? Those kind of unfortunate terms that are used sometimes for, I'm like, we don't use terms like that now, but I think that's how it might have been used then. So it's probably meant as an evil magician here.
All right, since she's still on the line, I'm going to ask Brenda's question. She'll wrap us up. How does The Crucible by Arthur Miller fit into this witch lore?
Well, that's a good question. Arthur Miller's Crucible was one of the things that helped keep Salem a tourist town, right? Salem has been a tourist town since the 1851. Nathaniel Hawthorne published House of Seven Gables, which is about witchcraft in Salem. It was a huge, huge hit in America. And it put Salem on the map as a tourist location for people coming to look at witchcraft places. So people would come to look at the House of Seven Gables. They try to find Gallows Hill. So Hawthorne's book made Salem like a tourist spot for people interested in witchcraft. Other books helped keep that alive. There was like Marion Starkey's book, The Devil in Massachusetts in the 1940s. But then once The Crucible came along, that was like super popular in the 50s. And again, helped like make Salem, which brought the Salem witch trials to people's minds again. It's not historically accurate. In the play, John Putnam is having an affair with, I want to say Abigail Williams is the woman he's having an affair with, an extramarital affair. Abigail Williams was really just an 11-year-old girl. No proof John Putnam had an affair with her at all. And also in The Crucible, Tituba, who was an enslaved person in Samuel Parris's house, is sort of shown like teaching the girls magic, right? She's shown teaching the girls magic. And that was not the situation either. She didn't teach the girls any magic at all. In the one case we have a recording of Tituba doing sort of some folk magic, was English folk magic, and she did it because she was instructed to by a Puritan woman. So like The Crucible really puts a lot of the blame on it for things on Tituba and says, oh, Tituba caused this. She kind of freaked the girls out with the teaching them magic. That didn't happen at all. But it makes a good play, but it didn't really happen at all. So I hope that helps answer the question a little bit about The Crucible.
So Peter, we've literally answered every question. We've responded to every comment. Kathy says, thank you. I have not heard many of these legends before, and I enjoyed the talk very much.
Welcome.
Oh, I guess we missed something from Julia. I'm sorry, Julia, but we are going to wrap it here. Peter, do you have any last words before we end the call?
No, I will just say thank you. This was a lot of fun. It's always a pleasure to speak for the Tewksbury Library, and it was fun answering all these questions.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Peter. We hosted a friend of yours, Sam Beltruis, a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, yeah, Sam is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And you are, I believe, the 6th speaker in our paranormal series this October. Tomorrow night we have Tim Weisberg.
Oh, great too.
About the history of the Bridgewater Triangle. And then this coming Saturday at 10 o'clock in the morning, we have Jeremy DeTremont speaking about haunted lighthouses of New England.
Oh, great.
Encourage folks to sign up for those as well, and look to additional talks next week and the following week. So I hope everyone had a great time. Check your emails tomorrow with a link to a feedback survey, a link to the recording, and more information about the upcoming paranormal programs. Thank you so much, Peter. Great job as usual, and we'll see you for your next book.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.